Daniel was born in the hustle and bustle of the city centre. He was the son of Frank, a street vendor who spent all day under the sun selling socks, caps and sunglasses on the sidewalk. From a young age, Daniel grew up among makeshift stalls, cardboard boxes, and the hurried coming and going of people on the main promenade. Life was never easy. His father would leave the house while it was still dark, pulling his cart of goods to get the best spot on the street. His mother, Sonia, helped however she could, sewing clothes for others, but the money was barely enough for rent and food. Daniel studied at a small public school, full of leaks, with broken chairs and overworked teachers. He'd go in flip-flops, often with a faded uniform. He lived with the smell of the street ingrained in his clothes, the smell of dust, of hot sun, of plastic merchandise. And because of that, he was a target for jokes at school. His classmates would mock him. "Hey, here comes the street vendor's son!" Another would shout, "Yo, Daniel, where's the sock cart?" The laughter hurt more than a slap. Daniel would lower his head, pretend not to hear, but he'd come home and cry in secret. Frank, his father, would try to console him. He'd say, "Son, there's no shame in working. Shame is in stealing." But for a 10-year-old boy, those words were little comfort, because all he wanted was to be like the others. To have new clothes, nice sneakers, not to be a laughingstock. Even so, Daniel was a smart kid. He liked to study. He was fascinated when the teacher talked about laws, rights, justice. He would hear difficult words and repeat them at home, trying to understand. Sometimes he'd come home from school and say, "Dad, did you know everyone has the right to a lawyer?" Frank would reply, "I know, son, but lawyers are expensive." Life went on, hard. On weekends, Daniel would go to help his father at the stall. He'd stand there shouting out deals to the customers. "3 pairs of socks for 10, ma'am." His father would smile with pride. But deep down, it hurt Daniel to see how people looked at his father, as if he were invisible, or worse, as if he were a criminal. One day when he was about 13, Daniel saw the worst of it. He was at his father's stall, helping to organize the merchandise, when the city inspectors arrived, along with municipal officials. They came in a group, shouting, telling the vendors to pack everything up. One of them pushed Frank's cart, knocking the boxes to the ground. Frank tried to reason with them, saying he paid his fees, that he had a license. But no one wanted to listen. One inspector said loudly, "Shut up, vendor, this is a prohibited area," and he shoved Frank away. The people around them watched, some with pity, others laughing. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to do something, but he was just a boy. He stood there, holding back tears, watching his father pick up the merchandise from the ground. And there, on that day, Daniel felt something he had never felt with such force: anger. On the way home, Frank walked with his head down. He said, "Son, that's life. When you're poor, you have to swallow a lot." But Daniel replied, his eyes still full of tears, "Dad, I don't want to swallow it. I'm going to become a lawyer. I'm going to defend people like you." Frank laughed, a little sad, a little proud. "A lawyer, son? That's for rich people." But Daniel shook his head firmly. "I'll do it, Dad, even if it takes my whole life." From that day on, something changed inside Daniel. He kept helping his father at the stall, kept going to school in his old uniform, kept being mocked by his classmates. But now he had a goal, a dream that beat stronger than any humiliation. At night he would read everything he could. He'd borrow books from the school library, read old pamphlets, and was fascinated whenever he saw a lawyer speaking on TV. He loved hearing those complicated words: habeas corpus, initial petition, oral arguments. While many people said he would never get off the streets, Daniel began to believe that he could, in fact, make it to a courtroom, that he could wear a suit, speak eloquently, and defend those who no one wanted to defend. But between that dream and reality, there was still a huge path, because to get there, he would have to overcome not only poverty, but prejudice, exhaustion, and the fear of failure. And even without knowing how, Daniel decided he would not give up. In the years that followed, Daniel grew up, but life stayed the same. His father continued on the street, under sun and rain. pushing the cart full of merchandise. His mother sewed late into the night, often with an aching back, to earn a few extra bucks. Daniel studied in the morning and went straight to help his father after school. He would stand for hours, shouting out deals, while watching friends from school walk by, some laughing, others pretending not to know him. It hurt a lot. But he swallowed his pride because he knew that every $10 bill his father put in his pocket was what put food on the table. Things weren't easy at school. Some people mocked him just for being a street vendor's son. One day, the teacher asked what each student wanted to be when they grew up. Some said doctor, others engineer, others wanted to be a soccer player. When it was Daniel's turn, he said, "I want to be a lawyer." The room erupted in laughter. A boy in the back shouted, "To defend street vendors." Another said, "A lawyer? You think you're going to be rich now?" Daniel turned red, held back tears, but said, "Yeah, to defend street vendors, to defend poor people who have no one to stand up for them." The teacher was moved, but even so, she couldn't contain the others' laughter. And that day, Daniel left school with a heavy heart, thinking that maybe no one would ever take his dreams seriously. But at home, his father looked at him and said, "Son, the ones who laugh at you today might one day applaud you. The important thing is that you don't give up." Those words hammered in Daniel's head. In high school, he started studying even harder. He borrowed books, spent hours in the library. Sometimes he'd read texts he didn't understand at all, but he didn't give up. He'd get home close to midnight, tired, but always with his notebook under his arm. Meanwhile, his father began to have health problems, the scorching sun, his back ruined from pulling the cart. One day, Frank felt sick in the middle of the street and collapsed on the ground. Daniel dropped everything and ran to hold his father. They took Frank to the public hospital. They waited for hours to be seen. In the waiting room, Daniel saw his father crying softly, saying, "Son, life is too hard for those born poor." Daniel held his hand and said, "I'm still going to make you proud, Dad. One day I'll be a lawyer and no one will ever humiliate you again." When he finished high school, Daniel decided to apply for law school. A lot of people laughed in his face. "You're going to study what? Law? That's for doctors' sons." But Daniel was not shaken. He registered at the public university and studied like never before. On the day of the exam, he left home early, his face serious. His mother wished him luck. His father rooted for him in silence. When he came back, he just said, "I did my best." 2 weeks later, the results were out. Daniel hadn't passed. His score was just a few points below the cutoff. He cried in his room, punching his pillow. He thought, maybe they're right. This isn't for me. But his father came into the room, saw his son crying and said, "Son, no one makes it on the first try. You'll try again." And Daniel did. The following year, he took a free community prep course, studied late, ate dry bread for breakfast to save money. He slept little, lived in a state of exhaustion. But deep down, the flame inside him wouldn't go out. For the next entrance exam, he left the house once again with his notebook under his arm. He took the whole test, sweating but confident. When the results were posted, he couldn't believe what he was reading. He had gotten into a private university for law with a 100% scholarship. He came home shouting, hugging his father and mother. Frank was crying and saying, "See, son, the ones who laugh at you today will one day applaud you." But even though he was happy, Daniel knew this was just the beginning, because getting into law school was only the first battle. Now came the hardest part, staying in. Starting law school for Daniel was like entering another world. He had never seen so many well-dressed people, carrying expensive backpacks, speaking in complicated terms, discussing laws and politics, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. On the first day, he walked into the classroom and immediately felt the atmosphere. A bunch of students talking about trips abroad, about internships at famous law firms, about relatives who were lawyers or judges. Daniel sat in a corner, quiet, with his simple notebook and old backpack, not knowing where to look. While the professor talked about the Constitution, fundamental rights, jurisprudence, Daniel tried to write everything down, but he didn't even understand half the words. He would repeat them quietly to himself. Habeas corpus, direct action of unconstitutionality. They sounded like secret codes. During breaks, he noticed how some classmates would gather in cliques talking about parties, conferences, expensive law prep courses. A girl looked at his notebook and said mockingly, "You take notes by hand? No one does that anymore." He gave an awkward smile, but felt his face get hot. There were days he left class almost in tears. He thought he wouldn't be able to keep up, that he didn't belong in that place. He thought, are they right? Is law really only for rich people? But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered his father. He remembered the inspector pushing Frank's cart, the boxes falling to the ground, his father crying, humiliated. And that made Daniel get up the next day and go to class again. To help out at home, he got a job at a stationery store downtown. He worked from 7 to 4. Then he would run to the university. He was almost always late. He'd sit in the back of the class, tired, often having skipped lunch. There were days he fell asleep on his notebook. Other times, he would read late into the night, even with his eyes burning. His mother, Sonia, would make him coffee to stay awake. She'd say, "Son, you're going to be a doctor of law. I know you will." But money was always tight. There were months he couldn't buy the required books. He had to borrow copies from classmates or spend hours reading old books in the university library. One day, the professor assigned a big project. Everyone had to print several color pages, get them bound. Daniel didn't have the money. He turned in his project printed on simple black and white sheets, stapled together. When he handed it in, the professor looked at it and said, "You didn't get this bound?" Daniel replied, embarrassed, "Professor, I couldn't afford it." The professor sighed and said, "All right, what matters is the content." But Daniel left there feeling deeply ashamed. Even so, he never got a bad grade. He studied like crazy, spent entire weekends reading, memorizing laws, watching free video lectures on YouTube. In his second year of college, he decided he needed to get an internship. He sent his resume to several firms, but no one called. Until one day he went in person to deliver his resume to a chic downtown office. The receptionist looked at his simple clothes and said in a cold tone, "Sorry, we have no openings." He left there crushed, wanting to disappear. But at the building's entrance, he saw an ad on a bulletin board. Intern needed for a labor law office. Preference for students with financial difficulties. He wrote down the number and called right away. The following week, he started at the small office of Mr. Morgan, an older lawyer who believed in giving a chance to those who needed it. There, Daniel began to learn for real. He saw case files, hearings, got to know the hard lives of workers fired without their rights, and he began to realize that this was exactly what he wanted to do, defend ordinary people. Even though he earned little at the internship, he felt happy, because for the first time, he was wearing a badge that said Law Intern. And when he got home, he would show it to his father and say, "See, Dad, one day I'll be wearing a suit in that courtroom." Frank would look on with pride, but say, "Take it easy, son. You still have to take care of your health." But Daniel didn't want to stop, because for him, every sleepless night was one step closer to getting his father off the street. And even though he was tired, he began to believe that maybe he really could win. At Mr. Morgan's office, Daniel began to see a side of the law that didn't appear in books. He saw the desperation of simple people who would come in crying because they had been fired without receiving anything. People who earned minimum wage and were left with nothing to eat. Many times, Mr. Morgan would handle hearings for free, just so a client wouldn't be left without a defense. And he would say to Daniel, "Practicing law is more than just making money, son. It's giving a voice to those no one hears." Those words echoed in Daniel's head. While he was learning at his internship, he kept up with his studies, but he still felt like a fish out of water. In class, many people flaunted expensive bags, talked about trips to Miami, about their parents who were appellate judges, prosecutors, or major businessmen. There was one time a professor assigned a group project. Daniel was randomly assigned to work with two classmates known for being the rich kids of the class. At the first meeting, one of them looked at Daniel and said with a laugh, "What do you do for work again? Are you a street vendor too?" Daniel took a deep breath and replied, "I work at a labor law office." The classmate laughed and said, "Oh, that explains it, one of those poor people's firms." That day, Daniel left the university wanting to quit. He walked slowly to the bus stop, remembering his childhood, the stalls on the street, the smell of plastic, the cruel laughter of his classmates. He thought, maybe I'm trying to enter a world that isn't for me. He came home silent. His mother asked what had happened, but he didn't want to talk. He locked himself in his room and stared at the ceiling. He cried softly, trying not to make a noise. But inside, there was still a voice saying, "You're going to make it." The next day, he went back to the university determined not to give up. He thought of his father, of the cart of goods, of the inspector pushing Frank in the middle of the street, and he decided that no one was going to take that dream away from him. At the office, Mr. Morgan noticed Daniel was down. He called him into the back room and asked, "What happened, son?" Daniel told him reluctantly. He said that some people laughed at him, that they thought he would never be a lawyer. Mr. Morgan looked at him sternly and said, "Daniel, let me tell you something. The world of law has a lot of arrogant people, but there's also room for those who are truly good. You've seen much more of life than those rich kids. One day, you'll be a great lawyer, and you'll be proud of your story." Those words lit something in Daniel. He went back to the university with his head held high. He started to study even more. He would stay late reading codes, jurisprudence, memorizing articles. At the internship, he started to accompany Mr. Morgan to hearings. At first, he would just observe quietly, but little by little, he started to help prepare the defenses, organize documents, even write simple petitions. Mr. Morgan would read what he wrote and say, "You have a knack for this, son. You write well. You know how to explain things to the judge as if you were talking to a real person. That's rare." Daniel would smile a bit shyly, because deep down, he was still afraid of not being good enough. Meanwhile, at home, the situation remained tight. Frank had more health problems. He had to stop working for a few months. It was a struggle. His mother almost gave up on everything. But Daniel would say, "Calm down, Mom. One day, I'll get Dad off the street." Around that time, Daniel started to save every penny. He stopped buying snacks, walked more, carried a water bottle so he wouldn't have to spend money on the street. He wanted to save up to pay for the bar exam registration as soon as he graduated. Because in his mind, he would only be a real lawyer when he had that license in his hand. In his final semesters of college, he began to stand out. Professors started to praise his participation in class. Some classmates who used to mock him began to come to him with questions, but there were still those who looked down on him. One day, a professor called Daniel over after class and said, "Have you thought about a career in public service?" He replied, "No, Professor. I want to be a lawyer for simple people. I want to defend the voiceless." The professor smiled and said, "Then you'll have a lot of work ahead of you, but the world needs people like you." Daniel left there with a lighter heart, because for the first time, he felt that someone important believed in him. And even though he knew the road was still long, he began to see that maybe he really could be the street vendor's son who triumphed in law. Time passed, and finally, graduation day arrived. Daniel, wearing a black cap and gown, stood in the corner of the hall holding his diploma, his hands shaking. He couldn't seem to believe he had made it this far. His mother was in the audience, crying the whole time. His father, Frank, was in simple clothes, but his chest was puffed out with pride. When they called his son's name, he stood up, shouted and clapped, not caring about the looks from those around him. After the ceremony, they took pictures together. His mother wiped her tears, saying, "My son is a lawyer." Frank hugged Daniel and said, his voice choked, "I always knew, son. I always knew you would succeed." But deep down, Daniel knew this was just the beginning, because graduating from law school didn't mean he was a lawyer yet. He needed to pass the bar exam, the most feared test for every law student. He started studying like a madman. There were days he stayed up until 2 in the morning memorizing articles of law. He walked around with his vade-mecum, the thick book everyone called the Brick. Meanwhile, he continued his internship, now working more closely with Mr. Morgan. He even participated in hearings, spoke with clients, and drafted important documents. More and more, he felt like he was in the world he had always dreamed of, but the fear of the bar exam haunted his thoughts day and night. On the day of the first test, Daniel left home early, carrying only his ID and the book. His father and mother stood at the door, holding his hands. Sonia said, "Son, whatever God wills, you're already a winner." During the test, he sat in a room full of people, all tense, sweating. When he started reading the questions, his head spun. They seemed like words in another language. He finished the test exhausted, not knowing if he had done well or not. The results came out weeks later. Daniel opened the website, holding his breath, and there it was, in writing. Failed. His world collapsed. He cried alone in his room, feeling like a failure. He thought, "I fought so hard, and I'm just not good enough." His father came into the room, saw his son crying, and said, "Son, the one who wins is the one who doesn't stop trying. You think I never took a fall selling on the street, but I got up the next day." Daniel wiped his tears. He knew his father was right, but even so, the shame was enormous. At the university, everyone was asking who had passed. People were posting photos of their approval, thanking God, their families, their professors, and Daniel just stayed quiet, pretending he was fine. At the office, Mr. Morgan called Daniel in for a talk. He said, "Son, you think I passed the bar on the first try? I failed twice, and look at me now with almost 40 years of practice. Stop being so hard on yourself." Daniel took a deep breath. He decided to try again. He enrolled in an online prep course, studied late, took practice exams, memorized precedents. He almost became a robot, but life didn't stop. His father got sick again, needed expensive medicine. His mother started having problems with her eyesight. Daniel had to work even more at the office to help at home. Even so, he didn't give up, and he went for the second test. On the day of the results, his heart was beating so hard, it felt like it would explode. He opened the website, trembling, and there it was, in writing, "Passed." Daniel shouted so loudly that the neighbors knocked on the door to see if everything was okay. His father cried. His mother knelt and thanked God. The next day, he went to pick up his bar card. When he held that red document in his hands, he felt like the whole world fit there. It wasn't just a piece of plastic. It was proof that the street vendor's son had made it. He went home, holding the document against his chest, smiling. He looked at his father and said, "Now no one will push you around on the street anymore, Dad, because now I can defend you." Frank hugged his son and cried. He said, "Son, I didn't know so much pride could fit inside a man's chest." And there, Daniel was sure that everything, every humiliation, every tear, every sleepless night had been worth it. After getting his bar card, Daniel spent a few days floating. It felt like everything around him had become lighter. But the euphoria soon gave way to reality, because having a law license didn't pay the bills. At Mr. Morgan's office, Daniel kept working. Now he could sign petitions, could meet with clients alone, but he didn't earn much. The office was small, always full of difficult cases, poor clients who could rarely afford to pay fees. Even so, Daniel felt alive there. Every story he heard moved him. Workers who were fired without getting anything, women who cried because their boss wouldn't formalize their employment, elderly people scammed by companies. One day, a woman named Mrs. Marlene came to the office. She was a street vendor who sold fruit, just as Daniel's father had been a vendor of socks. She was crying because the city had seized her stall. Daniel sat with her, listened to everything calmly. He was outraged. It felt like he was reliving the past, remembering the day he saw his father being pushed on the sidewalk by the inspectors. After Mrs. Marlene left, Daniel stood in the middle of the room, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He said to Mr. Morgan, "Sir, I have to take this case. It's not just a lawsuit. My whole life is in there." Mr. Morgan smiled and replied, "Then go for it, son. But be prepared. The city is a big fight." Daniel began to prepare the case. He spent nights reading municipal laws, jurisprudence, studying every detail. He wanted to find a way to get Mrs. Marlene's stall back and prevent other vendors from being treated like criminals. Meanwhile, his personal life wasn't getting any easier. His father still had health problems. His mother was always tired, her eyesight getting worse. The bills kept coming. Even so, Daniel told himself, "I'm a lawyer now. Now I can change things." On the day of Mrs. Marlene's hearing, Daniel woke up before sunrise. He put on his simple suit, tied his tie with trembling hands. He looked in the mirror and could hardly believe it. He remembered the boy in the old uniform, the smell of plastic, the cruel laughter at school. He arrived at the courthouse early, sat on a cold bench in the hallway, clutching the folder with the case file. When they called his name, his heart raced. In the courtroom, the city's attorney was there, full of papers, speaking firmly. He tried to argue that Mrs. Marlene was occupying public space, that it was illegal, that she was disrupting formal commerce. Daniel stood up slowly. When he began to speak, his voice was quiet, but it soon gained strength. He said, "Your Honor, Mrs. Marlene is not a criminal. She is a worker, and one cannot confuse poverty with illegality. The state cannot crush someone who is only trying to survive." As he spoke, he saw the judge watching him intently. He could feel the breath of the others in the room. He remembered his father. He remembered the boxes falling on the street. He remembered the tears he had held back so many times. And that gave him courage. At the end of the hearing, the judge ruled in favor of Mrs. Marlene. He ordered the stall to be returned and forbade new seizures without due process. Mrs. Marlene left crying, hugging Daniel. She said, "My son, you are my angel." Daniel returned to the office with his chest puffed out. Mr. Morgan clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Congratulations, counselor. You were a giant today." But even though he was happy, Daniel knew this was just one small victory in a sea of injustice. And there, on that day, he decided he wanted to dedicate his entire life to defending those no one else would defend, because he never again wanted to see anyone go through what his father had gone through. After Mrs. Marlene's case, Daniel's name began to circulate among the street vendors, market sellers, and simple workers. Humble people who were once afraid to even enter a courthouse started to seek him out. At the office door, there was someone waiting almost every day. A young man who sold cell phone cases, a lady who sold popcorn outside the school, a man who pulled a fruit cart. They all wanted to talk to the doctor who understands us. Daniel would see each one with patience. He listened to heavy stories, people threatened by inspectors, people owing rent because they lost their stall, people being called lazy just for trying to make a living. Even when he was tired, Daniel felt he was finally in the right place. But working on cases for simple people hardly brought in any money. Many clients couldn't pay fees. Some would pool their coins to give at least a down payment. Others would pay with pastries, with a bag of fruit, with a thank you. Mr. Morgan, his boss, saw all this and would say, "Daniel, I know you do this from the heart, but you also need to think about your own life. You can't live on good intentions alone." Daniel knew Mr. Morgan was right, but every time he thought about refusing a case, he remembered his father on the street, picking up socks from the ground, humiliated by the inspectors. Meanwhile, invitations for Daniel to speak at events started to come in. Universities, community centers, churches. Everyone wanted to hear the street vendor's son, who became a lawyer. At first, he would tremble just holding the microphone. He would break out in a cold sweat. His voice would choke, but then he started to enjoy it. He began to tell his own story, from his childhood on the promenade to the day he got his bar card. One day, in a packed auditorium, he said, "Being poor is not a crime. The crime is the state abandoning those who work hard." The audience gave him a standing ovation. From then on, he became a well-known figure. He started to appear in news articles, was invited on radio shows. One journalist wrote, "Daniel, the street vendor's son, is the new voice of people's justice." But even as he gained recognition, life remained a struggle. His mother still needed expensive medical appointments. His father could no longer work as before. Daniel remained torn between the dream of doing justice and the need to pay the bills. One evening, he came home late, exhausted, and found his mother sitting at the table looking at the bills. Sonia said, "Son, I can't stand to see you killing yourself. Isn't it time to look for a steady job at a big firm?" Daniel sighed. He knew that at a big firm he would earn well, but he also knew that there he couldn't choose his clients. And most of the time, he would be defending those who already had power. He looked at his mother and said, "Mom, if I join a big firm, I'll be just another lawyer in a suit defending people who already have money. I want to defend those who have no one." His mother was silent. She knew there was no point in insisting. A few days later, Daniel was at the courthouse when he ran into an old classmate. The young man was in an expensive suit, a shiny watch, an imported car. He greeted Daniel a bit awkwardly and asked, "Man, what are you still doing at that small office? You could be making real money at a big firm." Daniel smiled and replied, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The classmate shook his head as if he didn't understand and walked away. Daniel went back to his office. He looked at the pile of case files on his desk, sighed deeply, but smiled, because despite everything, he knew he was building something bigger than money. And deep down, he started to have an idea. He wanted to open his own office, focused only on simple people, a place where the poor wouldn't be afraid to enter, where no one would be treated as invisible. After that day at the courthouse, the idea of having his own office wouldn't leave Daniel's head. He'd get home, sit on the sofa, and sketch out plans in an old notebook. He'd write down names, draw the storefront, think about the motto he wanted to put on the door: "Justice for the voiceless." But it wasn't simple. Opening an office was expensive. He needed to pay rent, buy furniture, computers, hire interns, and Daniel barely had enough money to help at home. Even so, he didn't give up. He started to save every penny. He stopped taking the bus and started walking even more. He stopped buying new clothes. He turned down invitations to go out just to save a little money. Mr. Morgan, his boss, noticed the change. He called Daniel for a talk and said, "Son, you have talent, but opening an office is hard. You'll have no fixed salary. You'll be starting from scratch." Daniel replied, "I know, sir, but I have to try. I want a place where no one is afraid to walk in just because they're wearing flip-flops." Mr. Morgan gave him a light pat on the shoulder and said, "Then go for it, and know that if you need me, I'm here." Daniel started to spread the news among his clients. Simple people who didn't really understand what opening an office meant, but would say, "If you open it, I'll follow you, counselor." It was then that an opportunity arose. An old lawyer in the city was closing his small office, which was in a simple building downtown. The rent was cheap, but the place was falling apart, peeling paint, old furniture, a musty smell. Even so, Daniel went to see it. When he walked in, his heart pounded. He imagined plaques on the wall, simple people being treated with respect, cases being resolved. There, he saw his future. He signed the lease with the little savings he had. Then, he brought his father and mother to see it. Frank was moved. He ran his hand over the wall and said, "Son, it might look small, but it's a castle." Julian, a childhood friend, offered to help with the renovation. They painted the walls, cleaned everything, and improvised furniture. Daniel spent days painting, hammering nails, carrying boxes. On the opening day, there was no fancy party, just brewed coffee, a simple cake, and plastic chairs. But the place was packed. Street vendors, market sellers, humble people who wanted to give a hug to the counselor son of the street vendor. Daniel looked at it all and almost cried, because there he saw that he wasn't alone. In the very first month, dozens of cases came in, people being threatened with losing their spot to work, workers without a formal contract, families facing eviction. Daniel saw each one with calm, without rushing. One day, an old man came in, crying. He had been evicted from the shack where he lived. Daniel listened to everything, holding back his own tears. And he said, "I don't promise miracles, but I promise to fight until the end." Meanwhile, Daniel's name grew even more. News articles started to come out saying, "Lawyer son of a street vendor fights for the workers." The local TV station did a story showing the simple office, crowded with people. Even so, the difficulties didn't stop. There were months when Daniel couldn't pay the office rent. There were nights he slept right there because he didn't have money to go home. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered his father on the street, the inspectors knocking over the boxes of socks, and he would tell himself, "If I stop now, everything I've lived through will have been for nothing." And even when he was tired, Daniel knew he was living exactly the purpose he had always dreamed of. Because for him, there was no greater victory than seeing simple people walk into his office without fear, sit in the chair and say, "Counselor, I trust you." Time passed, and Daniel's office became too small for so many people. It was common to see a line on the sidewalk, people waiting for hours just to talk to him, but no one complained. On the contrary, they said it was worth the wait because the counselor listened like no one else. Some lawyers in the city started to criticize him. They said he was charging too little, that he was devaluing the profession. But Daniel didn't care. He knew that what he was doing was more than just law. It was historical reparation. It was around this time that he received an invitation to give a speech at a university, a big event with professors, judges, and students. The theme was people's justice and the poor's access to the judiciary. Daniel almost refused. He said he wasn't good at public speaking, but his father insisted, "You don't have to speak fancy, you just have to tell the truth." At the time of the speech, Daniel walked onto the stage and took a deep breath. The audience was full. He started by telling his own story. He talked about the sock cart, the heat on the asphalt, the shame he felt at school, the first time he saw his father treated like trash, and then he paused. He looked at the audience and said, "I'm not here because I'm a genius. I'm here because this country is full of people who fight in silence, people who have never had a defender, and I decided to be the voice for those people." The audience was silent for a few seconds, and then they started to give a standing ovation. From then on, Daniel was invited to speak all over the country, universities, NGOs, forums, congresses. Everyone wanted to hear the street vendor's son who became the people's lawyer. But he never left his office. He continued to see his clients in the same way. He would arrive early, listen to their stories calmly, go to the courthouses personally, carrying folders full of paper. And every time he won a case, he would call the client and say, "Justice has won again." And from the other end of the line, the same kind of response always came. "Thank you, counselor. May God bless you." One day, Daniel received an envelope. Inside was a special invitation. His name had been nominated to receive a Medal of Merit from the Bar Association for his social contribution to Brazilian justice. He couldn't believe it. He showed his father, his mother. Frank cried in silence. He took the invitation with sweaty hands and said, "This is what you've become, my son. A man who makes a difference." Daniel went to the ceremony. He walked in wearing a simple suit with worn shoes, but with his head held high. He went up on stage and received the medal with watery eyes. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about the award. He was thinking about all the times he had to pretend everything was okay, about all the times he slept on the office floor, about all the times he had to be strong, even without knowing if it would work out. And there, he understood that he wasn't just a street vendor's son who became a lawyer. He was living proof that no one can tell you where your place is. After the award ceremony, many people thought Daniel would change, that he would open an office in another city, charge more, hire a secretary, put down a fancy rug. But he did none of that. He went back to the same room, on the same corner, with the same noisy fan. He continued to drink coffee from a plastic cup and write everything by hand when the computer froze. One morning, he arrived and saw an envelope under the door. It had no return address. Inside, there was just a handwritten letter and a child's drawing. The letter said, "Counselor Daniel, my father wasn't arrested because you believed in him. I was 6 when that happened. Now I'm 12. I want to be a lawyer just like you. Thank you for changing my family." Daniel held the letter for a few minutes without saying anything. Then he taped the paper to the wall of his office, right next to the photo of him with his father at the vendor stall. That letter became a daily reminder. Real impact isn't in the headlines, it's in the lives no one sees. He continued like this for many years. Some said he was stubborn, others said he was foolish for not taking the opportunities to grow financially. But his clients said something else. They said he was necessary. One day, a new young lawyer came into the office. He had come from far away just to meet Daniel in person. He said he graduated inspired by him, and he made a request. "Could I possibly work here with you, even for free? I just want to learn." Daniel smiled, took a chair, dragged it to the side of his desk and replied, "Then sit down. Around here we learn by listening." And so the street vendor's son became a benchmark, not of status, not of wealth, but of purpose. And to this day, if you pass by that simple street in the city, you'll see a crooked little sign hanging on the door of a small office, written like this, "Law with a Heart." And if you're lucky enough to go inside, you'll find Daniel there, pen in hand, a discreet smile, and plenty of time to listen to your story, because he knows that every person deserves someone who believes in them. And that's what he became, someone who believes. All right, it's that time. If this story has you hooked, let's do the full ritual. Hit the like button to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss a beat, and ring that bell to be the first to know what's coming. Your opinion is golden, so drop it in the comments below.